There's a way of looking at what's happening between the United States, Israel, and Iran that goes beyond the immediate events of late February 2026. Some analysts argue this isn't just about responding to an urgent threat. Instead, they see it as part of a much longer game that's been playing out for decades across the Middle East. The argument goes something like this. The real goal isn't just degrading Iran's military or stopping a nuclear program. It's about who controls the region and, crucially, who controls the energy that flows out of it. Now, this is one interpretation among several. Others see things differently, which we'll get into. But this particular framework predicts something interesting, that killing Supreme Leader Khamenei and Iran's top officials won't make the regime collapse. Instead, it might do the opposite, handing even more power to the hardliners in the Revolutionary Guard. And if that happens, the thinking goes, we're not looking at a quick, decisive victory. We're looking at a long, grinding conflict that could drag on through missile exchanges and airstrikes without any clear end. Let's walk through what this framework actually claims, look at what we know for certain, and examine where different analysts see things heading in completely different directions. The historical argument starts with a pattern that some observers believe they can trace back through Iraq, Libya, Syria, and other countries where the United States has intervened militarily over the past few decades. The claim is that there's been a consistent strategy, not just reactive decision-making in response to different crises. Here's what actually happened in those places. Iraq in 2003 was explicitly about regime change. The Bush administration wanted Saddam Hussein gone, justified the invasion through claims about weapons of mass destruction that turned out not to exist, and succeeded in removing Hussein. He was captured, tried, and executed. But what came after was years of insurgency, sectarian violence between Sunnis and Shiites, and eventually the rise of ISIS. That's not what the planners had in mind. Libya in 2011 saw NATO intervene during a civil war, operating under UN authorization that was supposed to be about protecting civilians. The operation evolved into actively supporting rebels and targeting Gaddafi's forces. Gaddafi ended up dead, dragged from a drainage pipe and killed by rebel fighters. The country then splintered into competing militias and rival governments, and it's still fragmented today. Syria is messier because the U.S. didn't launch a full invasion. Instead, starting around 2011-2012, there was support for opposition groups fighting Assad. The goals kept shifting, countering ISIS, limiting Iranian influence, sometimes supporting Assad's removal. Assad's government, backed heavily by Russia and Iran, survived despite years of civil war. So the question becomes, do these interventions show a coordinated long-term strategy, or are they separate responses to different situations that just happen to go badly? The strategic framework interprets them as part of a deliberate pattern. The alternative view says American policy in the Middle East has actually been pretty inconsistent, driven more by domestic politics, bureaucratic infighting, and reacting to events than by any master plan. On Iran specifically, U.S. policy has actually swung back and forth quite a bit. The Obama administration negotiated the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, as a diplomatic solution. Trump pulled out of it and went with maximum pressure through sanctions. And now we have direct military strikes. Whether this represents one consistent strategy or major policy shifts depends entirely on how you interpret it. Now let's talk about energy, because this is where the framework makes a big claim about underlying motives. The argument is that securing control over Middle Eastern oil and gas and the routes they travel through is what this is really about, even if officials don't say it out loud. The numbers are striking. The Persian Gulf region holds roughly 48% of the world's proven oil reserves and 38% of natural gas reserves. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, sees about 21 million barrels of oil pass through every single day. That's roughly 1/5 of all the petroleum consumed globally. According to this analysis, controlling these resources and routes gives you strategic leverage over countries that depend on energy imports: China, Japan, South Korea, much of Europe. If you can replace hostile governments with friendly ones in this region, you strengthen your position enormously. Now that's the theory. What we know for certain is that the U.S. military maintains a significant presence in the Gulf through bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE. The Fifth Fleet operates out of Bahrain specifically to keep those shipping lanes open. But here's the thing, U.S. officials aren't talking about energy control in their public statements. They're talking about preventing nuclear weapons, degrading missile capabilities, and supporting the Iranian people's desire for change. So is energy control a hidden primary objective, or is it more of a secondary benefit? We can't actually know what's being discussed in classified strategy sessions in Washington and Tel Aviv. Outside analysts are reading between the lines. The alternative interpretation takes the nuclear concern at face value. If Iran developed nuclear weapons, it would fundamentally alter the regional balance, threaten Israel's security, and potentially trigger nuclear proliferation to Saudi Arabia and other countries. From this perspective, that's a genuine existential concern that drives policy, not an excuse covering energy ambitions. The really interesting prediction in this strategic framework is about what happens after you kill a country's supreme leader and military chiefs. The conventional wisdom might say, regime collapses, people rise up, democracy follows. This framework predicts the opposite. The argument is that authoritarian regimes typically respond to external military pressure by centralizing power even more, cracking down harder on internal opposition, and rallying nationalist sentiment against foreign attackers. The people running the security services don't just give up, they dig in. History gives us mixed evidence here. North Korea is the classic example of a regime that survived decades of pressure and isolation by using external threats to justify total control. The leadership tells the population that only they can protect the nation from hostile foreign powers, and that's been working for 3 generations of the Kim family. On the flip side, Libya's Gaddafi got overthrown when military pressure combined with an internal uprising. But then, look what happened. The country fell apart into competing armed groups with no functional central government. So even when regime change succeeds militarily, the aftermath can be chaotic. For Iran right now, we've got confirmed evidence of celebrations in multiple cities after Khamenei's death was announced. Videos show people in Tehran, Isfahan, Karaj, Kermanshah, and Shiraz dancing in the streets, setting off fireworks, handing out sweets. That's real opposition sentiment, not manufactured. But here's the complicating factor. The Revolutionary Guard and security forces still have guns, organizational structure, and they've already shown they're willing to kill civilians on a massive scale. U.S. officials have cited figures from Iranian health ministry sources suggesting around 30,000 to 32,000 protesters were killed during the 2025-2026 demonstrations. That's not crowd control. That's systematic suppression. So which force wins out? The celebratory opposition or the heavily armed security apparatus? That's genuinely uncertain. The constitutional process says the Assembly of Experts should select a new supreme leader, but they can't safely meet while airstrikes are ongoing. Reports suggest the Revolutionary Guard might just appoint someone themselves, bypassing the formal process. If that happens, you've got military rule in all but name, which is exactly what this strategic framework predicts. The framework also argues this conflict won't be quick. Instead, we're looking at what's called a war of attrition, prolonged missile strikes, air operations, retaliatory cycles, without any decisive victory by either side. Iran's got a missile arsenal estimated in the thousands with various ranges and capabilities. On February 28th, Iran launched over 200 missiles and drones at Israel, U.S. bases, and several Gulf Arab countries. At least 2 people died, including a woman in Tel Aviv and someone in Abu Dhabi. Over 20 others were wounded in Tel Aviv alone. Those missiles reached their targets despite defensive systems. Iranian missiles can hit Israeli cities in roughly 10 to 15 minutes, depending on the type and trajectory. That's not much warning time. Israel has multiple defense layers: Iron Dome for short-range threats, David's Sling for medium range, Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 for ballistic missiles. These systems work, but they're not perfect. Here's where the attrition math comes in. Each Arrow interceptor costs somewhere between $2 and $3 million. Iron Dome interceptors run about $40,000 to $50,000 each. Iranian missiles are cheaper. If Iran can sustain attacks, Israel has to keep firing expensive interceptors, and those stockpiles aren't infinite. Eventually, you run through your inventory faster than you can manufacture replacements. That's the theory anyway. The counter-argument is that you're not just sitting there absorbing attacks. You're also striking Iranian missile launchers, storage sites, and production facilities. The U.S. military has Aegis-equipped ships providing additional defensive coverage. And American industrial capacity can produce interceptors pretty quickly when needed. Whether this turns into prolonged attrition or a relatively quick operation depends on several unknowns. Can the U.S. and Israel effectively destroy enough Iranian missile infrastructure? How many missiles does Iran actually have? How quickly can Iran replace losses? Can they maintain attacks for weeks or months? We don't have definitive answers yet. What about Russia and China? This is where the framework suggests external support might change the equation, even if neither country openly joins the fighting. China imports Iranian oil, roughly 1 to 1.5 million barrels per day despite sanctions. That's meaningful but not critical for China, which imports about 11 million barrels daily total. Losing Iranian supplies would hurt but wouldn't cripple the Chinese economy. However, China has a strategic interest beyond just oil. If the U.S. can successfully overthrow governments through military force without consequence, that sets a precedent China definitely doesn't want. Russia has sold weapons to Iran, including S-300 air defense systems, and they have military cooperation agreements. But Russia's also dealing with its own commitments in Ukraine and elsewhere. They're not in a position to send troops or massive amounts of equipment without serious consequences. So what kind of support might actually happen? Intelligence sharing is the obvious one. Russia and China have satellites. They can track U.S. ship movements, aircraft deployments, and provide that information to Iran. That helps with targeting and defensive preparations without directly involving Chinese or Russian forces. Financial support is another avenue, continuing to buy Iranian oil, offering credit lines, helping Iran evade sanctions through alternative payment systems, keeping Iran economically functional enough to keep fighting. Technology transfers might happen too, particularly for missile guidance systems, electronic warfare capabilities, or air defense improvements. These don't require sending personnel and can be done quietly. Will all this actually materialize? We'll find out based on Iranian capabilities over the coming weeks. If Iranian strikes show sophisticated targeting suggesting external intelligence, that's evidence for it. If Iranian capabilities rapidly degrade, that suggests they're on their own. Now let's talk about American domestic politics, because that matters too. The framework argues that public opinion is against this war, which creates political vulnerability for Trump. Historical patterns suggest that Americans initially support military operations, then support declines as operations drag on, casualties mount, and costs add up. The Iraq War followed exactly that pattern. Started with strong majority support, ended with majority opposition after years of occupation. But short, successful operations can maintain support. The 1991 Gulf War expelled Iraq from Kuwait in a matter of weeks with minimal U.S. casualties, and it remained popular. So the political outcome depends heavily on how this plays out. If operations achieve regime change relatively quickly without many American casualties, the political backlash might be minimal. If this turns into a prolonged conflict with mounting costs and no clear victory, domestic pressure on the administration would intensify significantly. Congressional elections are coming up in 2026, and foreign policy disasters can shift control of Congress. The United Nations Security Council comes into this too. The framework characterizes it as divided between U.S. allies and countries pushing back against American dominance, which reflects a broader shift in global power dynamics. The Security Council's permanent members are the U.S., Russia, China, UK, and France, each with veto power. On Middle East issues, Russia and China frequently oppose U.S. positions, while the U.S. vetoes resolutions it doesn't like. It's been deadlocked on these issues for years. Countries hosting U.S. military bases like the Gulf Arab states, Japan, and South Korea generally align with Washington publicly, though sometimes with private reservations. But characterizing all of them as automatic supporters oversimplifies their positions. These countries have their own interests and sometimes diverge from U.S. preferences. The bigger question is whether we're seeing a shift from a unipolar world where the U.S. was the sole superpower after the Cold War to a multipolar world with several major power centers. China's economic and military rise, Russia's reassertion of regional influence, and middle powers acting more independently all suggest movement in that direction. But here's where interpretation matters. Some analysts see the U.S. ability to conduct major operations against Iran, despite international objections, as proof that American power is still dominant. Others see the inability to build a broad coalition and the potential for Chinese and Russian opposition as evidence that the unipolar moment has passed. So, pulling this all together, the strategic framework argues that we're watching a planned regional dominance strategy unfold, that killing Iran's leaders will consolidate hardline control rather than produce collapse, that we're headed for prolonged conflict, that Russia and China might provide behind-the-scenes support, that American public opinion creates political risk, and that all of this accelerates the shift to a multipolar world order. That's one way to see it. But there are other frameworks reaching different conclusions from the same facts. Democratic transformation advocates look at those street celebrations and see genuine opportunity for positive change if the opposition gets proper support. They point to the 30,000-plus protesters killed as evidence the regime lacked legitimacy and only held power through terror. Nuclear nonproliferation analysts focus primarily on whether the strikes successfully destroyed Iran's nuclear infrastructure and killed enough scientists to set the program back years or decades. For them, regime change is secondary to preventing nuclear weapons. Humanitarian analysts emphasize the reported 201 killed and 747 wounded across Iran in the initial strikes, including over 100 schoolchildren allegedly killed when a girls' school was hit. They're concerned about civilian casualties, refugee flows, and the broader human cost, regardless of whether strategic objectives are achieved. Regional security analysts debate whether removing Iranian influence stabilizes the Middle East by cutting support to Hezbollah, Hamas, and other groups, or whether it creates a power vacuum that leads to even more chaos, similar to what happened after Saddam Hussein's removal in Iraq. Energy market analysts are watching the Strait of Hormuz closely. Iran has threatened to close it. If that happens, oil prices could spike to $150 or $200 per barrel, potentially triggering global recession. That's not about strategy or ideology. That's about immediate economic consequences. What we know for certain is this. Khamenei was killed on February 28th. Senior Iranian military and political officials were targeted, with multiple casualties reported but not all confirmed. Iran launched over 200 retaliatory missiles and drones, causing casualties in Israel and elsewhere. Celebrations occurred in multiple Iranian cities. The succession process faces complications because the Assembly of Experts can't safely convene during ongoing strikes. U.S. and Israeli operations are continuing. Multiple countries have closed their airspace. Oil shipping is disrupted. What we don't know. Will the opposition successfully challenge Revolutionary Guard control, or will the IRGC consolidate power? Will Russia and China provide significant support to Iran? How long will operations continue? What's the ultimate casualty count? Will this turn into prolonged war of attrition or conclude relatively quickly? Can diplomatic intervention prevent further escalation? What happens to oil markets and global economy? Will this accelerate the multipolar shift, or is that overstated? The strategic framework we've been exploring represents one analytical lens. It emphasizes historical patterns, skepticism about regime change success, attention to great power competition, and prediction of prolonged conflict. Other frameworks emphasize different factors and reach different conclusions. Which proves most accurate will become clear as events continue to unfold in the coming days, weeks, and potentially months.